Welcome to the Deep Dive.
Great to be here.
We're diving into some really interesting source material today. It's a document looking at, well, a specific perspective on Christian disciple-making and church planting.
Yeah, it definitely it challenges some of the maybe more conventional thinking. It looks at how beliefs spread and, importantly, how our own culture kind of interacts with these spiritual ideas, sometimes maybe without us realizing it.
That's a good way to put it. So our mission, really, for this deep dive is to unpack the core ideas in these excerpts. We want to explore surprising challenges the author talks about, and especially that sharp line they draw between planting the gospel and, as they put it, reproducing religion.
Right. And as we go, you should listen for some key takeaways. There's a really strong focus on the main goal being about addressing lostness in society. And it also highlights the potential, sometimes significant negative impact of what we might call traditional Christian culture. And then there's this really crucial argument about the difference between, well, religion and spirituality.
Okay, yeah, let's get into that.
Yeah.
So the starting point. The source kicks off pretty directly about the objective. It's not, they say, about starting a specific kind of movement.
Right. Not like saying, we must start house churches or it has to look exactly like this existing structure.
Exactly.
The real goal from this perspective, it's more fundamental. It's about meeting and addressing lostness everywhere, in every part of society, through the gospel.
That's the target.
That's the bullseye, yeah.
And what's fascinating then is how that shapes the view of what a church actually, looks like. They say, and this is the quote, "I truly have no preconceived ideas of what form the local church takes."
Which is quite a statement.
It is. The idea is that the form just sort of emerges organically as people connect with Christ and, communities start living things out.
Yeah, it kind of flips the usual script, doesn't it? Instead of having a template for a church service or a building first, the priority is people encountering Christ. The source really emphasizes that the church, well, it belongs to Christ. He determines how it grows, what it looks like.
And believers just do their part in following.
Exactly. Believers play their part.
Okay, so that leads naturally into this idea of flexibility. Specifically the flexibility that obedience allows rather than pushing for everyone to be the same uniformity.
Yeah, that's a strong point they make. Different cultures, different segments of society, they're going to put church together differently as they, respond to the Bible and follow God's leading.
And the assertion is pretty bold.
Yeah.
There isn't just only one way to obey the mandates of the word in connection to the church.
Right. They give examples, don't they? Like, not everyone has to worship the same way or pray or serve or fast or even sing identically in every single context.
So differences are expected,
Yeah.
even big ones, depending on the context, the culture, the social setting, whatever. But that doesn't mean people aren't being obedient. It might mean house churches pop up somewhere,
Sure.
but maybe totally different kinds of structures or gatherings elsewhere. The form follows the function of obedience, really.
Yeah, it prioritizes that core mission and the act of obedience over just, copying a specific institutional model.
It suggests that focusing too much on one form might actually get in the way of the main goal.
Exactly. It could hinder it.
Okay, so here's where, for me, it gets really interesting. It's clearly a huge point for the author. They talk about the single biggest hurdle. And it's about identifying our own personal cultures, like our religious upbringing, maybe even nationalistic stuff, and stopping those things from permeating new work.
And this is where the source makes a very strong, maybe even, uncomfortable claim for some.
Yeah.
It specifically calls out Christian culture, says it can have an extremely negative impact on disciple making.
Wow. Okay.
And even calls it often a barrier to people falling in love with Jesus.
That's a really powerful statement. They're careful, though, right, to distinguish this Christian culture, the human traditions, the styles, the expectations from God himself or, the core teachings of the Bible.
Absolutely. It's about the cultural layer, not the core faith. And their observation is that, well, fewer people today, in many places, want anything to do with stuff that just feels like traditional Christian culture.
Or anything that looks or feels religious in that conventional way.
Exactly. Which is why this source says they intentionally try to avoid, churchy words or jargon or traditional titles.
Especially when first connecting with people outside the faith.
Right. Though they do add a nuance, don't they, about places like North America?
Yeah, where was that?
That sometimes people who are coming to faith in these new contexts might actually start using some of those words or practices themselves.
Ah.
And the approach then is to let them make those choices. It's not imposed from the outside by the planter or missionary.
Got it. So, okay, if culture is the hurdle, what specific things, what elements of traditional church culture does the source say they actively avoid transferring?
Right. They list several things they see as extra-biblical, at least as requirements for new communities.
Okay, let's take them off. First, they avoid focusing only on starting churches that must look exactly like an existing one, a specific denomination or doctrine.
Yep. Second, requiring a really formal, institutionalized education process for all leaders. Not just some, but all.
Third, making formal ordination the only necessary qualification for leadership.
Mm-hmm. Fourth, having really high or strict control over teaching and preaching and how things like baptism or the Lord's Supper are done.
Requiring that only formally ordained leaders can do those things.
Exactly. Fifth, putting a really high priority on having a dedicated building that's called church.
Okay.
And finally, just maintaining high centralized control over all the aspects of how the church operates.
No, they do add that caveat, right? They're not saying these things are necessarily wrong for an existing church.
No, absolutely not. An existing organization has the freedom to structure itself how it sees fit.
But the critical point for new work aimed at reaching people outside the current structures
Yes.
is that many of these requirements, while maybe not forbidden, are often extra-biblical meaning, not explicitly commanded in the Bible as requirements for everyone.
Right. And crucially,
They slow things down.
they slow church planting in such a way that natural replication cannot happen. That's the key phrase.
So the argument is imposing these complex structures makes it hard for new, maybe simpler communities to just form and multiply quickly in different places.
Exactly. And they also add that, just slapping the label movement onto existing work doesn't really change anything if you're still exporting all their same complex elements.
That makes sense. And the author actually shares a personal consequence of this, right?
Yeah, they mention it. It got me into trouble with my denomination.
Because the denomination wanted the new work to look like the old work.
To conform. Even though the author felt that very conformity was actually stopping them from reaching people effectively.
Wow. Okay. So connecting this to the bigger picture, the source links this difficulty, this pressure to conform, to that statistic about traditional churches losing ground to population growth.
Right. They're suggesting there's a connection there.
So while traditional church spaces, whether institutional or even house churches, definitely work for many.
Absolutely. And are helpful for many.
The source is arguing that there's this ever-increasing number of people who just reject that culture. They're looking for something different.
And this approach is specifically trying to reach that group.
Yeah. And the author's pretty honest about how hard this is to do personally, isn't he? This deculturalizing.
Oh, yeah. After years, like the 25 years mentioned, in traditional settings, consciously working against your own ingrained habits and cultural assumptions, it takes constant effort.
It's an internal struggle. Okay, so now we get to what feels like the strategic core. This really crucial distinction they make. Never equate religion and spirituality.
Yes. Let's unpack their definitions because they're quite specific here.
Right.
Religion, according to the source, is about how we do church. It's the structures, the rituals, the programs. The institutional side.
The how. Okay. And spirituality.
Spirituality is about how we live out our relationship with God and people. So it's focused on the internal reality, how that plays out in daily life, leading to transformation in individuals, families, communities.
Right. The internal reality and its outward expression.
Exactly. So the core argument for being effective in disciple-making, according to this source, is that being less religious and more spiritual actually makes you more effective.
It's a direct link in their view. Less religious, more spiritual, more effective.
That's the argument.
And why? What's the reasoning?
It's pretty blunt. Lost people, they say, are mostly repulsed by religion, but inexplicably drawn to spiritual men and women.
Okay, so they see that genuine, lived-out spirituality, that relationship with God and others. That's the magnet.
That's the attractive force. Whereas the cultural forms, the religion, often act as a barrier, a repellent.
So the idea is that focusing on authentic spiritual life, showing love, showing transformation, that cuts through cultural noise that maybe religious structures create.
That seems to be the core idea.
Which brings it all back, really, to the simplest, most powerful thing the source mentions right near the end.
Love. Yeah.
Love.
When we love people, they know it. It's that simple.
That demonstration of just genuine care, that relationship, it speaks louder.
Mhm.
It opens the ears, as they say.
Right. It opens the ears to the message in a way that just words or maybe just structures often can't.
So the call to action here isn't really about a program. It's more about embodying a principle.
Love the people, and they will come to Christ as you minister to them and lead them to discover God for themselves.
It really puts the emphasis on the authentic demonstration of love and spiritual life in real relationships as the main catalyst.
Yeah. More so, perhaps, than sticking strictly to certain religious forms or structures.
Okay, so let's recap briefly. We've dived into this perspective that argues the main mission is reaching lostness, not just copying an institution.
Right. And that the form the church takes should be flexible, emerge from the context.
And critically, that our own culture, even specifically Christian culture, can actually be a pretty big barrier sometimes.
Which leads them to deliberately avoid transferring certain traditional, often extra-biblical requirements.
Because they think those things hinder that natural, reproducible growth needed today.
Mm-hmm. And underlying all of it is that really sharp distinction between religion, how we do church, and spirituality, how we live our relationship with God and others.
Arguing that spirituality is the real point of connection for people outside the faith.
And it all comes down to, fundamentally, genuinely loving people.
So why is this relevant to you, listening? Well, it gives you a really specific way to think about that complex dance between core beliefs, the cultures and structures that grow up around them.
Yeah, and how those things affect whether the original message actually gets through and is received.
It kind of forces you to ask, maybe, whether the forms we've inherited or created might sometimes, unintentionally, get in the way of the basic purpose.
Definitely food for thought. And maybe here's something provocative for you to mull over based on this. The source draws that very clear line between religion, how we do church, and spirituality, how we live out our relationship.
Oh, yeah?
Thinking about that distinction, where else in life do you see the how we do things, the structures, the procedures, the culture potentially becoming a barrier to the core of what we're trying to accomplish?
Like maybe in business? Or education?
Yeah.
Even hobbies?
It could be anywhere, really, where the form gets in the way of the function.
Something to think about as you go about your day.